Hello there. Welcome to another movie review stream. My name is Mark McPherson, film critic for movieswithmark.com, filminquiry.com, and TwinCitiesGeek.com. And yeah, this stream right before Christmas, and we got quite a few Christmas movies to cover. A few big ones, a few small ones. So we'll get right to it here, especially since we'll have more to cover next week as well with the end of the year lists, which I'm plowing away on most of the films that I'm trying to catch up on, as well as a few more that are coming out for the rest of the year, as well as the for your consideration stuff. So that's all coming up. So what do we got on the stream? Well, today we're going to be reviewing Babylon, the latest from Damien Chazelle. I'll also be reviewing Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, the latest animated film from DreamWorks, which might actually surprise you. That's what I got to say about that. We'll also review Living, which is the English remake of Ikaru. We will also be taking a look at Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio. I have to make that distinction, too, with all the Pinocchio films this year. And then we'll also be taking a look at All Quiet on the Western Front, the latest German war epic, currently on Netflix. So we've got a lot of ground to cover, so we'll just get right into it. Sorry, I gotta grab the credits here. And let's not waste any time. Let's go right into the big one coming out this weekend. And the one I haven't stopped thinking about, and the one that I want to talk about immediately. So let me get my notes up here and get a good drink of water here, because I got a lot to say about this one. All right. So here we go. 3, 2, 1. So Babylon is the latest film from Damien Chazelle. And I dare say, I know this might sound a little odd to start this off, but I feel like this might be Damien's biggest film to date. And it's not just because it's 3 hours long. It's not just because it has an all-star ensemble cast, which is just massive. All that stuff does make it big, mind you. But the material that he wants to cover here, and I think the general tone that he wants to establish for presenting this sort of love letter, but also an honest critique of old Hollywood and, how he feels about cinema, which is both heartfelt, nostalgic, but also scathing and satirical at times. It's such a big and broad film that it honestly kind of works for this dizzying, wild party style that he has for it. So it takes place between the 1920s and the 1930s and in Hollywood, with the chaotic celebratory scene of just people who are in the business of making movies. And from I love how this film establishes what type of movie it's going to be right from the very first few 5 minutes of the film. Within the first 5 minutes, there's some bizarre stuff. I've mentioned in my review, the things that happen within the first 5 minutes, you would not believe me if I told you what happened. Which I'll say it. Within the first 2 minutes or so, there's a scene of an elephant shitting all over someone's face, and later, not too long after that, there's a scene of somebody pissing into someone's face. And this all culminates in this giant, party, which is overflowing with sex, booze, drugs, orgies, jazz music, dancing, people getting launched out of windows, cars crashing. All this chaos is going on within the first 5 minutes. And it only just keeps going from there. So in this just this fast-paced, tightly edited, and of course you can kind of sense Damien would do this type of editing if you look at stuff like La La Land and Whiplash. This very I don't quite want to say tightly edited, but very quick edits. We get to establish a few characters. We get to see Brad Pitt as Jack Conrad, who's this kind of silent era star who's had the sweet life. He's been able to breeze through marriages with ease. He gets drunk a lot. He thinks nothing about losing women. He gets all these parts. He kind of easily can like just go on to set after drinking so much and deliver a perfect scene for a silent movie. So we get to meet him. We also get to meet Nellie Leroy, played by Margot Robbie, who's essentially a party girl who kind of like falls into, you know, certain scenes. Like she has no invitation. She has no invitation to this party. She just like makes her way through by, you know, wooing the right guys and talking up the right people, and eventually she becomes an actress. The same goes for Manny, played by Diego Calva. And he's just an assistant just trying to like do the right thing and, you know, just, you know, make it ahead in life. And he ends up becoming a production assistant working alongside Jack Conrad. So those I would say are probably the three key characters that we follow throughout like the 20s and 30s as we watch cinema change over that time, going into like the sound era and how some people adapt and some people don't. So it's very much a rise and fall story that goes over the course of 3 hours. In addition to that, though, we have all these great supporting characters in there. In particular, I feel like the most interesting, who we get just like the right amount of, is Jean Smart plays Eleanor St. John, this kind of like aged film journalist who's familiar enough with the medium and how it exists, and kind of gives like the most like sagely advice, especially to Jack, while stating like the general thesis of this film about how movies will ultimately outlive us all. More or less, it's more or less about, you know, recognizing this point in time, loving it for all it's worth, while still recognizing like a somewhat of like an immortality that comes with like filmmaking, where even if, you know, you decay and you drift away, like some part of what you've done will still be up there on screen, and people decades, years from now, you know, maybe centuries, will still watch you up on the screen. So there's very much like this kind of essence of kind of like existential dread within the characters, of realizing how far they can go in these careers and how much length they have to their own mortality in both their actual lives and their actual careers. And then, of course, like I said, there's plenty of other characters we follow. Another interesting character is Sidney Palmer, a jazz trumpeter played by Johann Adepo, I think I'm saying his name correctly. And I found his character really interesting because we get to see him kind of like rise slowly from just being like a trumpeter at like parties who lives in kind of like a rundown house, and then later on we get to see him in like a mansion when he kind of like moves up, and then we get to see him encounter like a new sort of like racism that comes with being within like the high society of this Hollywood scene and trying to adapt. And I love how they kind of like weave his story into how like Nellie can't really adapt to high society as well, which is probably one of like the most intense. There's a lot of intense scenes in this film, but I think definitely one of the most intense is like this party where Nellie is struggling to, you know, kind of seem prim and proper, and Manny's trying to maintain Nellie's behavior as well, while at the same time Sidney is trying to get used to all these like white people trying to, you know, more or less say that he's like one of the good ones and all that. So there's a lot of ground covered here, and that's just, and keep in mind these are mostly just like the key characters. There are so many other surprise characters surprise guest stars who show up throughout this. You have Spike Jonze as this eccentric German director who's constantly furious about losing cameras and losing light and everything going wrong on set. You have Jeff Garlin playing like, you know, a typical snooty Hollywood executive. You have you have like Jack's wives played by like Olivia Wilde and Catherine Waterston, I believe. Who else you have? You have Tobey Maguire playing this like cracked out bizarre gangster who leads people into this weird underground world where people have wild sex and bite the heads off of animals. There's some just flat out bizarre wild stuff in this film. And it feels like it wouldn't connect. It's like, okay, what's this doing here? But the pacing and the tone of all of this makes just this surreal ride all come together, where it's equal parts love letter and scathing satire of old Hollywood, while having like this very knowing nature about it. Like, I love the meta commentary that goes on with like within like some of like the technical aspects. In particular, when movie studios first start shooting with sound in this film, there's a sequence that like it's straight out of like if you've ever seen Living in Oblivion. Which is a film all about filmmaking, but like all like the stuff that goes wrong on set, which forces you to do the same thing over and over and over just to get it right. There's a similar scene like that in Babylon where it's just them trying to get the microphone working and just it's not everything that they're recording is not working with what they're shooting, and everything goes wrong on set. Everyone gets angry and furious and hot and sweaty and just frustrated to all hell, and it's just and it's one of those scenes where it's just like you want to laugh at the absurdity, but like you understand like how pissed off everyone would be in the scene. That it's just, and especially for like the punchline here, like the punchline it essentially involves someone dying, and there's a whole lot of that in this film. Like when I say like this film is also like a scathing satire, it doesn't shy away from like the more dangerous elements, like especially how when they would shoot like a war epic of like the silent era, everything would go wrong on set. Like the explosions would go off the wrong way. Like people would get hurt on set. People would die on set. Cameras would get destroyed, and they have to like race around town to get like a new camera and get back there. It's fast-paced chaos that the fact that any of it comes together is just like a miracle. Which is kind of like how I've always kind of like viewed filmmaking. It's like making a movie is a huge responsibility. So many elements have to come together, and the fact that a film can even get completed is a huge accomplishment. And if it's a great film, it feels like a miracle if you can get that far. So to have all that in this film, and then just the score by Justin Hurwitz is just so intoxicating. Like Justin has done like scores on like other Chazelle films, like a lot of the stuff in like La La Land. I've kind of loved that soundtrack. Babylon I love even more, just because like I cannot get some of that music out of my head. I cannot stop thinking about Voodoo Mama, which is the song that plays when Nelly is dancing for a crowd in the opening party, and I believe it closes out the film as well, just because it has like those pumping bass, the pumping drums, and just like the out of control trumpeting and the just like the rhythmic chorus going to it. All of it is just so it perfectly culminates everything that I love about this film. And then after so much has happened, like it's just it would take too long to go through the whole plot, so it's just like I'll just say that it keeps building up on like crazier stuff that happens. Like careers will rise and fall. Some people will commit suicide. Some people will go weird routes. Like there's a weird sequence where someone gets bitten by a snake. There's this nostalgic twinge that people have, like from those who do live through the silent era and make it into the era of sound and kind of lament on that. But the best thing about this film, I think, is probably, and here's the thing, this is the element that's going to polarize audiences deeply. When you get to the end of this film, there is just this whirlwind of just like relating to everything that film was and going to be, that it becomes, I'm trying to find the right words to it. It's just like a surreal smearing of all things cinema. Like you get to see clips from famous movies, past and present. You get to see, relating back to what happened within Babylon. You get to see the production of film, how it's made, what chemicals are used, and then just like the flat out, just like the colors that make up the basics of just like red, blue, and green, all smashed together in like this fast cut, and Justin's jazz score is going with all of it, and it's just all culminates together in like just this huge smeared like chaos of celebrating everything that's good and bad about movies and taking it all in with this sort of like almost transcendent love letter and just celebration of all things that go into it, while still recognizing all of its faults. And for that, like, for being that bold and that brash, and especially like it gets pretty grotesque here with all like the violence and sex and vulgarity and the racism and everything that comes with it, that it is definitely not going to be everyone's cup of tea. It is going to be a deeply polarizing film, but honestly, for what it's trying to be and everything that it presents here, and especially given Damien Chazelle's body of work through like stuff like La La Land and First Man and stuff like that, this film just, it was so much my jam. I loved everything that it's about. The performances are fantastic, especially for what is demanded, like all these actors and just the huge ensemble cast here, and then just the vibrant decadence and the fast-paced editing and Justin's score and just that bold ending that you have to this film. It's such a towering masterpiece that I love it so much. Like I said, this is definitely not going to be for everyone. If you wince at stuff like sex and violence, and just like, focusing on the filmmaking process isn't your bag, this is not going to be your film. You are probably going to despise this. But for what it's presenting here, like I said, this is my jam. It's my happening, baby, and it freaks me out, and I love it so much. Love me some Babylon. Okay, so Babylon is currently playing in theaters right now. It is through Paramount. So chances are if you wait like a month or two, come the award season, it'll probably end up on Paramount Plus soon, just so that everyone can see it. Like, that's usually always like the problem that happens with like the more awards-worthy films. Is like they... like, you want to recommend them, but everyone's like, oh, where are these films? I didn't see them. It's like, well, they're going to be on a streaming platform eventually, if they're not already, All right. So that was the big one. Hopefully my voice holds out until then. All right, let's get to the next one here. A bit of a surprise, this one. Okay, so let's get my notes up here. All the voices. Okay, and in 3, 2, 1. So, Puss in Boots, The Last Wish. For a spinoff to Shrek, I gotta admit, like, I've kind of dug what they do with Puss in Boots. Like, like Shrek was fun here and there because it was fairy tale satire. But I honestly kind of dig what they do with Puss in Boots to make him sort of more of like an action hero and give him a little bit more to do. Because for as tired as, for a character that's been around for like 20 years, it feels like a film like this could just be like another standard retread through fairy tale stuff, especially for tapping into like, like the Goldilocks and the Three Bears and what was the other villain they had for this one? Little Jack Horner, for tapping into all that. I gotta admit, this film actually works. For what this film tries to be, I have to admit, I really, really did love what they were doing with it. And I just, oh crap, I'm sorry. The notes, sorry, the notes just crapped out of me here. I gotta grab them here, but. Hang on to that thought. Hang on. I'm going to reset here, but hang on to that thought because I do actually like this film. And I will explain why. I will make my case here in just a moment. I just lost my notes. Okay, here we go. I got my notes back. I always got to have my notes there because I always mispronounce names and I always forget actors. So here we go. Okay. And in 3, 2, 1. So, Puss in Boots, The Last Wish. It's once again, we're back with Puss in Boots, the character who's been around in the Shrek world since, almost like 20 years now. And for a character who's been around that long, it would feel like a film like this, especially one that kind of recognizes the fact that Puss is getting older and that this character's been around for a long enough time, it would feel like there's not much gas in coming back to this franchise. But surprisingly, very much a surprise, like, this film actually works for what it sets out to be. And the thing is, like, it could have just gone on autopilot. Because you see, especially for, like, the first act, I was kind of, like, like feeling like, I don't know about this first act. It's like, I don't know where they're going with this. I don't know if I kind of dig the kind of gags that they're going to do here. But then slowly, as I think it built up on its themes of coming to terms with your own mortality and and just like, desiring more out of life. I think the story here actually really comes together, while still looking stylish. Like it looked, the animation itself looked amazing from the trailers and everything, and it still looks great here. And it helps that you have a story that actually carries some greater emotional heft than just being, like the standard fairy tale satire that we've seen in like all the Shrek films and the Puss in Boots stuff. So the story this time around is Puss in Boots, once again voiced by Antonio Banderas, once more hamming it up in the role as best he can with his deep voice, is basically realized that he's not going to live forever. He's used up just about all of his 9 lives and realizes that, I'm on my last one. I've kind of wasted them because I've laughed at death this whole time, but, death comes for us all, so what are you going to do? And death literally comes for Puss in Boots in the form of this Grim Reaper character, this kind of like wolf carrying scythes. I think, is it scythes or like, I think no, it's not a scythe. It's like sickles, basically. I was going to say scythe because, Grim Reaper, but essentially the Grim Reaper has come for Puss in Boots and it's like, look, I know your time is up. It's going to be up soon, and I know you're going to screw up. And so Puss in Boots basically realizes I can't keep doing the hero bit anymore since I've used up so many of my lives and so many action-packed sequences, especially like the one at the beginning where all it takes is one mistake and he's dead. And realizing this, Puss basically decides to retire. He moves in with a crazy cat lady who has a bunch of other weird-looking cats. But then eventually he realizes that, oh wait, there's a I think it's like a shooting star that's fallen, and that if you find it, after acquiring this magical map, you can make your ultimate wish. And of course, Puss desires more life, so obviously that's his wish, and he sets off for that. Now, of course, for adults watching this, they know that's not going to be the wish. They know that eventually, the journey is going to be what matters, and that he's going to learn that there's more to life than immortality, and that, accepting your fate and that you might die someday will bring you contentment, and that it'll bring you together with other people, So he makes few friends along the way. He meets Kitty Softpaws, played by Selma Hayek, who essentially, she's a thief. She ends up being a love interest, and of course, she needs to realize that she needs to rely on other people in the same way that Puss needs to as well. So they more or less have the same arc here. And of course, you have Antonio Banderas and Selma Hayek playing off each other, which they do fairly well. I don't feel like they have as much like romantic chemistry. I think more or less through like the visuals, I think it's communicated more than the performances. Although I will say they definitely do have chemistry here. It definitely works. In addition to that, he also has the cutest, most innocent sidekick in this, a little therapy dog called Perito, who's voiced by Javier Guillén. Yeah, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. And he's so adorable. It's in case like, Puss and Kitty doing like, like the standard, like, cute kitty look, which they've been doing forever, wasn't cute enough. You also have like a little dog who's even more innocent and more pure. And of course he becomes the heart and soul and, pushes Puss to be a better person. Well, at the same time, just being hilarious with all his, he has probably some of the funniest lines. And I think it's mostly just because, he kind of cusses at one point. Like it's censored out for this, but like they make the joke like, oh, he's saying dirty words and all that. So you get a little bit of fun out of that. Now the central villain in all this, aside from like the Grim Reaper, who's like the ultimate villain, is you have John Mulaney voicing Little Jack Horner. Except in this version, he has the nickname of Big. So it's like only his head is small, I think, and then everything else about him is huge. So Jack has made his entire life just as essentially kind of like a gangster / collector of fairy tale artifacts. So you get a lot of fun stuff with him, kind of using all these elements of fairy tales to sort of like just pilfer and build up his collection, which adds to like the caper element, which works really well here. And plus, like Mulaney's performance is pretty good for having like this kind of like knowing nature to Jack Horner, and giving like the character more of his own depth instead of just doing like the same gimmick with the thumb. They do a little bit of the whole like sticking the thumb in the pie thing, There's a few jokes about that, just enough so that it doesn't exhaust. And I think that it helps that there's an abundance of like other fairy tale stuff for him to tap into. In particular, I like the aspect of having Jiminy Cricket try to like be his conscience, but realizing that Jack's kind of a lost cause. So like it's great. You get to see like Jiminy try to find like the innocence and try to advocate for some good in humanity, and Jack just keeps subverting it at every time, just misusing all of the lore within like fairy tales and all like the thematic elements for more sinister desires. So I kind of like that conflict. It's decently set up and it's used just enough where you never get tired of it. So he's a good villain, although like the Death Wolf, I guess if you want to call him, voiced by Wagner Moura, is so much fun too. Like I dug his performance, especially since he's very much, he's full on sinister in this film. Like up to like the last scene in the film where it's kind of like a surrender or a contentment with death, he's mostly just straight up evil throughout the picture. Like we're like like I was gonna say, like you get a little bit into like seventh like the seventh seal type territory here a little bit. Like there's like twinges of like little hints of it you can see here and there, but I think that's more or less just the whole existentialism that comes with Puss coming to the realization of his own mortality. And as if all that weren't enough, you also have Goldilocks and her three bears, who are also after the treasure here. Just to give like a little bit more depth and a little bit more of a challenge for Puss, as opposed to just relying on just like a handful of villains. There's a lot of villains here, and you really get to like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, especially since the bears themselves are more proper and they're refined enough where like they'll shout and they'll scream and they'll roar and they'll use their claws. But then when it comes to intimidation, they'll kind of be a little bit more prim and proper, kind of like typical gangsters. And then having Goldilocks just kind of like being this frizzy-haired warrior wielding a staff is so cool. You get a lot of fun fight scenes with her. That's just like all these elements, when you use just enough of them, I feel really come together well in this film, where I was surprised by how much I was invested in Puss over time. Like, you kind of gotta get through like the first act with a lot of like the typical cat jokes that they have here, with like cats scratching down walls and Puss hanging out with like the crazy cat lady and all these other cats. It's once you get through all that stuff, the film really takes off, and I love it so much after that point. Especially the visuals here are amazing. Like, I love the fact that the magical map they have changes the world depending on who is holding it, so you get a lot of changes in environments, and by the time you get up to like the big shooting star, which will grant the last wish, there's all this color going about the screen, and it's such like a trippy sight. And I also got to really appreciate the extra touch of having like the reduced frames for the action sequences. So if you're familiar with the Spider-Man like Into the Spider-Verse, how they would essentially operate not so much on like twos, but kind of like a reduced frame rate so that there's more key poses you can pick out. They do that for all the action scenes specifically, and it kind of gives it a nice touch. It kind of feels a little bit more dynamic. It slows it down enough where like you can appreciate the sights of like Puss scaling up this giant, or dashing around like fighting people with swords. And then when you have like the slower moments of like emotion and showing expression in faces, you can have that smoother frame rate with the animation. And I feel like dicing that up works so well because it has this very refreshing nature where it feels like you're not just seeing the same thing over and over here. And like and especially with how many CGI animated films are so fluid with the action, you wish there was like something better to them. Having this dynamic nature is great because it allows for so many cool shots and it lets you appreciate them without just being blinded by like the blur of everything that's going on in the chaos. So honestly, for taking all like the fairy tale elements here and kind of weaving them together into this tale about mortality and putting yourself above others, this works. So yeah, surprise, I actually really dug Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. I have no clue if this is going to be the last Puss in Boots film. It seems like it might be, just because like they hint at the cat's mortality and that he might not be able to do this forever. But hey, if this is going to be the last film, this is probably the best note to go out on. So yeah, Puss in Boots is currently playing in theaters. I think it started playing it on Wednesday, just to get ahead of Babylon for the Christmas crowd. So currently playing in theaters, and then I think it should be, let's see, it's through DreamWorks, I think. So not sure what streaming service it'll be on. Hey, Sucked. Babylon seems more interesting than what other critics are saying, especially the ending you described. I may check it. Definitely. Here's the thing. It's very deeply polarized. Like, a lot of people are going to be pointing out the Rotten Tomatoes score, and I hate when they do this, because all the reviews have not been counted yet. Specifically, and I say this because my review, which is through a venue that is going to be picked up by Rotten Tomatoes, hasn't been properly published yet. It is going to be published soon, and it's overwhelmingly positive. I absolutely love this film. Like I said, the way I described it, this film's deeply polarized, so it kind of makes sense that on Rotten Tomatoes right now, it's half and half. But over time, I think when more people go to see this, they're actually gonna love it. When more reviews get out about this, I wouldn't be surprised if it goes back up to fresh on there, because this film was totally my jam, and I effing love it. And like I said, it's not gonna be for everyone. And specifically, I was reading through some of the reviews, and one of them actually brought up like the piss and shit that I mentioned within the first 5 minutes, and that was like the immediate turn off. So like I said, if you can get through like the elephant shit and the piss sex scene, this film will definitely be for you. It's a lot of fun. Definitely go check it out. Also, thank you, Morty. I suck at reading these usernames, so forgive me. Morty more use for the follow there. Thank you so much for subscribing. Okay, so that's 2 films down. And that's 2 of like the big Christmas films. But of course, those are the big ones. We covered the big one for kids, the big one for adults. Very much the big one for adults. Well, let's cover something a little smaller. So just in case you get exhausted, you need to see something else at the theater, something a little bit different. I'm not going to say quite original because this is a remake, but it's a remake of the film from the 50s, so maybe it'll be fresh. So let me get my notes up here. All right, let's see. Okay. All right, and 3, 2, 1. So, Living is the British remake of the Kurosawa film Ikaru. Now, if you're familiar with Ikaru, it's a 1950s film about a man who has spent his whole life working in the office and then realizing that he doesn't have much longer to live. But having spent so much time with having like this kind of office job and not having done much with it, he realizes he hasn't really lived, and tries to make the most of his life by making sure that a playground is built. So this English remake, it takes place I think it pretty much takes place within the same time frame, but it's set in England, and it's more or less the same story. You have Bill Nighy playing Mr. Williams, this guy who works in an office that decides on permits for building, and has basically spent his whole life just stooped in bureaucracy, and he's gained a lot of respect over the years, but it's just kind of like a respect that feels hollow. Everyone talks about him as like the prim and proper guy. He always does his work. He's efficient. He's kind of quiet and he's dignified. And he's like the cream of the crop, the top ranks. He knows how to deal with everything. And he's the expert on like shuffling stuff around and making sure that nothing gets done. So a pure bureaucrat. And then when he gets the horrible news that he's dying, he doesn't know what to do with it. He grows sad. He's conflicted. He doesn't tell his family because he feels like, it's just going to be a burden on them. It doesn't feel like he needs to know anything. So he decides like, oh, I'm just going to take out some money. I'm going to try to find a way to live. I'm going to try to find the fun stuff to do in life. I'm going to, hang out with this guy, and I'm going to hit up, bars and taverns. We're going to play a sad song, and I'm going to sing along to it. And we're going to indulge in like the arcades and stuff like that. And the thing is, for being a remake of Ikaru, you're going to get a lot of familiar scenes here. And this is one of those remakes that is like, it feels so faithful and heartfelt to adapt like the original and stay true to it, especially for like reconnecting with that era and having similar scenes that like I love the film, but I love it in kind of the way that I love like any any English remake of like a great film, and that is just directly replicating it. So on one level, I could totally understand if someone doesn't like this film, if they're just like, we already have Ikaru. Ikaru is an amazing film. If you haven't seen it yet, everyone should see it. It's a Kurosawa classic. They're just like, go watch that instead. And I would definitely say, even if you really like, seeing Bill Nighy in this role, you should definitely see the original if you haven't already. But for being an English remake, and having so many similar scenes, I feel like it kind of works here. So like I said, you get familiar scenes here. Like in Ikaru, there's like that tragic moment where the central character wants an old song to be played at a tavern, and he starts singing along with it, and everyone kind of like is digging on what he's singing, but the song gets sadder and sadder, and eventually he's just blubbering the lyrics, and he can barely get through it and just stops and can barely sing another note. It's the same thing in Living too. You have Bill Nighy singing like an old I think it's like an old Scottish song, and just he grows more and more sad, and then just kind of trails off and says he's sorry and kind of shuffles away. And it's a deeply sad moment. It's not, I don't feel it has as much impact as Ikaru, just because like you can feel like the emotion and the tears draining from his face in that scene. But in Living, it's kind of just Bill Nighy kind of like slowly trying to like struggle to maintain that dignity that comes with realizing that I've thrown too much of myself out there. And there are a lot more quiet moments in the film that you get to spend with him, where he connects with Margaret Harris, played by Amy Lou Wood, who's essentially just like a young woman in the office who kind of like has dreams and aspirations, and Bill Nighy desiring more and more to stay out of the office and experience life away from all the bureaucracy and just live his life to the fullest. He ends up connecting more with Margaret, while at the same time realizing that it's a bit odd that I'm hanging out with you and it's odd, but I want to connect with someone in this life because I don't feel close to my family. I don't feel close to any of the workers in my department, and I want to do something meaningful. And after all that, eventually, yes, he does realize that, yes, there's this playground that is desired to be built, and I could make it happen if I just, try and put my best foot forward. And eventually he does, and he stays firm on it, and eventually, yeah, the playground gets built, and we get that very touching moment where after it's finally built up, he sits on the swing and just takes a moment to enjoy life. And my review is kind of like short on this because it's essentially the same praise of like Ikaru. It more or less goes through the same scenes here, with the exception of a few, because it's a little bit tighter. It's much, I believe it's like 2 hours exactly, so it's like a little bit, I believe it's like much more shorter than the original film. And it mostly it touches on like the same beats as the original as well. So it's a fairly standard remake, but it's also a very faithful adaptation where I'm trying to imagine, like, if you haven't seen Ikaru, if you would, watch this film, just coming in cold, you would probably actually love it. You'd probably love the performance from Bill Nighy. He does have this very, like, quiet, refined performance here where you can see the sadness kind of wash over him with few words, and how, like, a simple dinner can go from being just like a friendly experience to like a depressing one so quickly, that his acting here just works. But like I said, it's your faithful yet kind of like I I've already seen this before, and it's still good, but I feel like the original is much more better. So yeah. I mean, obviously, like it feels like this goes without saying, but yes, the original Kurosawa film is still the top adaptation of this story, and Living is just kind of like the good but not great interpretation of the same story. It's basically the same story with an English coding, and for what it's worth, for what it's trying to be, it mostly hits all the right notes, and I do love the performances and the pacing and the kind of like quiet and inspiring nature to it. All that works here where I like the film. I like it a lot. It's just not as great as the Kurosawa film. So there you go. Living should be playing in a handful of theaters this Christmas, and then I think it will be expanding into a few theaters as we get more into January, but it probably won't go too far. So if you really want to watch it, keep an eye out for it. Keep an eye out for it. Okay. So what's next? Guillermo del Toro's Pinnochio. Here we go. Had to clarify it too. Alright, let's get the notes up here. There is the voice cast. Gotta make sure I got them all. Okay. Let me get a drink of water too, because I'm losing my voice. Alright. In 3, 2, 1. So Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio is probably the most refreshing take on Pinocchio all year. And I know that's a low bar. You look at all the Pinocchio films this year, that's a really low bar to cross. But it crosses it incredibly well, just because Del Toro, he has like a much bigger idea with what he wants this Pinocchio film to be about, and make it about something more than just the standard story of growing up and learning virtues and, learning all about the dangers of vices. Here, Del Toro actually makes his film about learning about the ills of fascism and capitalism. And he makes it pretty fervently clear so that, enough of like the younger audience could understand a film like this. This uniquely surreal and bizarre stop-motion animated adventure that is filled with music and drama and lots of darkness. So I'll preface this by saying, yes, the film is incredibly sad and has this somber tone where even its kind of like heartfelt ending still ends on a little bit of like a downer note. And the one film I kept thinking about with this was, and I think it's just because like Del Toro has talked about this film as well, was Watership Down. So for those who've never seen it, Watership Down, this film about rabbits who go on the run trying to find a new home, and many of them end up just kind of like hunted and savaged and gored, and it's an incredibly violent animated film, and it's rated PG. So there's been a lot of like a lot of concerned parents about that film. But Del Toro talked about Watership Down as kind of like that perfect film for kids who feel like animation has outgrown them, and that it doesn't have, and that some animated films don't have anything more to say to say for them. In the same way that kind of like kids will look at saying like, okay, cartoons aren't for me anymore. I'm gonna toss them aside. I'm gonna grow up. I'm an adult now. So like Watership Down is like, one of those eye-opening experiences. Like, oh, animation doesn't just have to be, kid-friendly. It can actually be about more serious topics of, life and death and, fighting for what you believe in. And that's very much what this Pinocchio is like, too. This version of Pinocchio is very much about, recognizing the ills of society and trying to fight back against them. And it's very much like with a lot of Del Toro stuff that focuses on horror. There is a lot of horror elements in this Pinocchio film, especially with how you how they set up Geppetto as having this child that he lost tragically, and then trying to rebuild him, and then realizing that he might have created a monster that could never quite replace his son. So it's very much like the Astro Boy story here, especially with like the horror elements of how Pinocchio is built. Like, it's straight up terrifying. Like, Geppetto chops down a tree, especially you're having Geppetto voiced by David Bradley, who you might recognize from some of Del Toro's other works, who just gives this raspy voiced, haggard Geppetto who's bitter about the world. Chops down a tree, there's thunder and lightning in the background, he goes home and just kind of like drunkenly smashes together this Pinocchio, which is just horrifying. And then you get to have like the cricket Sebastian watches this and just utter shock. So Sebastian, more or less Jiminy Cricket here, voiced by Ewan McGregor, has his own desires as well. Like, he's not just like there, to be the conscience of Pinocchio. He's more or less there for a deal. Fairy shows up and he's like, hey, I want to live in this Pinocchio guy because I'm trying to write a book. Could you maybe help me out here? And this fairy who brings Pinocchio to life says, like, tell you what, you make sure this kid stays out of trouble, and I'll get you a publishing deal. What do you say? And it takes off from there. So yeah, like, Sebastian's kind of more or less sticking with Pinocchio. And I love that, Sebastian has to learn a little something here too, instead of just trying to, force this kid to do what he wants just to get what he wants as well. So this aspect of kind of sacrifice very much plays into more than just one character. Just even beyond like Pinocchio, just like sacrificing himself and additionally sacrificing his own immortality, which is kind of like an interesting aspect, especially when you have Tilda Swinton voicing these two spirits. One is the spirit who grants Pinocchio life. The other is the one who grants him an immortality, but a measured level of immortality. While just having this very intimidating presence to her. It's just so cool to see in the film. But then also you have like the opposing forces here. You have Christoph Waltz playing Count Vulp, this this circus runner who basically swindles Pinocchio into a contract to work for him. Says like, oh yeah, I'll give you a cut and some money, but not really, because I'm a greedy son of a bitch. So that's this whole deal. But then of course his monkey realizes that Pinocchio's getting a raw deal. Maybe I should help him out. A similar situation happens when the Podesta, the main fascist leader, played by Ron Perlman, recruits Pinocchio to be in the army because they're like, oh, an immoral puppet, we could send him to the front lines and have him fight for fascism. He has his own son as well, who realized that, oh yeah, this is also a raw deal you're giving Pinocchio. It's not fair to force him into a war, especially since our war is based on the most hypocritical and mean ideas that are not worth fighting for. So he realized at that point, yeah, I gotta stick up for Pinocchio. So it's sacrifice across the board here for everyone, learning that if you want to make the world a better place, you got to sacrifice something for it. And I love the fact that the film recognizes a certain it recognizes mortality and comes to terms with it, because like I said, this is very much a heavy film, and I've heard some people saying like this Pinocchio is not a version for kids, and it's debatable whether or not like your kids would like it or not, but I think it more or less lines up with like Del Toro's idea for like animated films being like more of a transition point from like when kids become teenagers and feel like animation is kind of is something to leave in the toy box. It's like Del Toro's like, no, here, pull it out. There's other stuff you can do with it here. I think like Del Toro kind of said like Watership Down would be like for like kids who are like 11 or 12 years old in there, when they feel like animation doesn't have much more to offer, because definitely this version of Pinocchio does. And I love how it's set up. I love that its themes are very blunt. In particular, I really love the scene where like just after Pinocchio has been forced into a situation of either going with Volpe or going with the Podesta, so basically choosing between either serving capitalism or serving fascism, and Geppetto is just like, he eventually decides like, oh, we should go with Volpe, but then Pinocchio says, I don't want to go with either, and Geppetto basically says, look, you got to go with one of these guys because they got us over a barrel. But Pinocchio's like, but why do we have to do this? Why does the world have to be like this? And Geppetto just gives this frustrated like, look, I don't know. This is just the world that we were born into, you know? He doesn't exactly say that, but that's more or less the message here, which is like, look, we're not born into this world. We didn't get to decide how this world is. We were just born into it, and we kind of have to shape it as we see fit. Otherwise, we're just kind of like going with the flow and just going with whoever is in charge decides. And this becomes very much more apparent when they throw Mussolini into the mix. They just mock the hell out of Mussolini by just putting on a puppet show, just nothing but farts and poop. Just there's a giant poop puppet, you know. This is all Mussolini gets. He gets poop. So, yeah, very much an anti-fascist film. And for as much as, like, I like that blunt messaging and it kind of works, the film almost... It's weird because, like, the film kind of feels like it has, like, this kind of anthology format to it where it's, like, the many adventures of Pinocchio. In fact, if you wanted to make it more distinct, you probably could have just called it, like, the many adventures of Pinocchio. And say like, okay, here's like, you know, like Pinocchio's journey into, you know, into fame and understanding capitalism. Here he is going into war and understanding fascism. Here he is, you know, fighting for survival. You could dice it up that way. And the film kind of does, but it proceeds in kind of like diced up episodic formats where it doesn't feel like we're getting segments as much as we are just like, oh, okay, we'll leave the Podesta stuff alone for a little bit, and then we'll come back to it. We'll leave Volpe alone for a little bit, and we'll come back to him here, and then we'll, you know, kind of smear him here and there. And it kind of has a messy nature to it, where I feel like that's the biggest problem with this film, is that it becomes a bit unfocused with so many areas that it wants to tap into, because it taps into like religious zealotry as well, on top of everything else that goes into like sacrifice and, you know, questioning capitalism and fascism. So there's a lot going on in this film, and in some parts I feel like it's blunt enough, but on another level you almost kind of feel like this could have been weaved in a little bit better. Like this type of script could have touched on something a little bit. It could have weaved these bigger elements together in a much more cohesive manner. As opposed to just saying like, oh, okay, here's like, you know, his encounter with the Podesta, and we're done with that now. We're just going to focus on the rest of everything else that's going here. And I know that's more or less like the format of how the Pinocchio story has been told over the years, but you almost kind of wish that Del Toro's film would go a little bit further with that and just, and not feel so dicey and kind of have more of like a straightforward line with what it's trying to communicate, as opposed to just being like, you know, Pinocchio's ultimate, you know, rise to becoming a real boy, just laden with all these blunt messages placed here and there along the path. So that's like my biggest problem with the film. But other than that, I love everything about this film. I love the animation. I love the you know, the musical numbers. I love a few musical numbers here and there. Some of them I feel like they don't work, but I do like how like they fit the narrative well. Like I love how Pinocchio's first song when he comes to life is equal parts curious as it is frustrating for Geppetto. So it definitely, like, I love that the musical numbers touch on a few different notes here. The animation I really do like. You could tell like they definitely put a lot of work into the stop motion, which I would expect no less from Guillermo del Toro. Del Toro is all about making his visual effects really remarkable and also have a lot of fluidity and detail in them, where he pays attention to like just the tiniest elements. Like if you've seen like his work on like Pacific Rim and how he does stuff behind the scenes, he's very much detail oriented, and there's a lot of that in this film that I feel like it works. So I really do, like, in terms of like animated films this year, I don't feel like it's the best film. Like I said, you know, a lot of people say this. Yes, this is the best Pinocchio film. Like the Disney one we had this year was garbage, obviously. So, and then we had like a even more bizarre one earlier in the year, which had Pauly Shore doing a voice. So yes, this is the better Pinocchio film. Nobody is going to argue against that. But I feel like for like this type of animated film, which is bold And I love that because it's definitely going to be a film that I think like much older audiences are going to appreciate, especially with how it deals with existentialism. But I but I feel like it's just messy enough where I don't feel like it can be great. It's a very like I love the film technically and I love its messaging. I just wish that the story was a little bit more cohesive because and by the time it got to I love the ending here, which addresses mortality in the most like direct and kind of like somber, but also kind of like not quite like transcendent, but almost just like a means of acceptance. So for an animated film to go into that territory while still kind of having a little bit of like a kid-friendly edge to it, I feel like it works enough. Where yeah, it's a very enjoyable and refreshing Pinocchio film. Much better than the Disney film. So Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio is currently playing on Netflix. It had a limited theatrical run last month, I think. No, wait. At the beginning of this month, I think it had a limited theatrical run. I think. Wait, was it? No, wait. Actually, God, sorry. I'm getting all mixed up here. I believe a few weeks ago it did have a limited theatrical run, and then just so that they could push it for award season, which they definitely will. Would not surprise me. So you'll probably see this on the list of the best animated films of the year. All right, one last review. Let's knock this one out of the park here. We'll knock this one out and we'll be home free. Holiday break. And what better way to close out, to maneuver our way into Christmas than reviewing a somber and violent German war film. And the only reason I'm covering this now is just because it's probably going to end up on some awards list this year. Alright, let me get my notes up here. And get my notes up. Okay, and 3, 2, 1. So All Quiet on the Western Front is the latest adaptation of the novel that criticizes World War I among the German forces and the horrors of war. So very much like, very much how like the original book and even like the first movie adaptation was very much an anti-war film. This version also goes much harder on making it an anti-war film. So you can kind of think of this version as kind of like a technical upgrade from how the previous film was. Because like if you want to make an anti-war film, one of the biggest things you want to do is you want to showcase how horrific it is. And much like films like Sam Mendes' like 1917, this is very much in that same league of like making war this grand like operatic setting, but also making it hideous and ugly and violent and just depressing as all out. And the thing is, I was kind of a little bit conflicted about this film because I was thinking a little bit about what I think it was like Francois Truffaut said that it's impossible to make a film about war that is anti-war because it feels like if you're shooting war and you're trying to stage it to like a faithful degree, it almost feels like you're advocating for it by showcasing it, which has very much been like the case with like films that require like when we make war films in America, they tend to go through like the DOD just to get approved. So it feels like they very much have to be like war propaganda films. Like we've seen it with like Top Gun Maverick, where it's just like it's Navy propaganda pretty much. So to have like a film like All Quiet on the Western Front feels very necessary. For like it feels like a very necessary remake for what it presents here because it is an intense experience. Like we follow a handful of characters. I think maybe about like around 4 or 5 characters I think we follow, but I think like the 2 primary ones we follow is Paul, played by Felix Kammermer, and Kat, played by Ulrich Schultz. So we follow a handful of characters who sign up for, to serve as German soldiers in World War One. They lie about their age. They're all giddy and excited, like, yeah, it'll be fun to jump right into the war. But I love the fact that this film starts off with like the ugliness right away. It doesn't just like start with like, hey, yeah, let's all go to war and let's have fun and fight for our country and die horribly. It'll be great. It'll be fun. The film actually starts by just showcasing like the dead bodies of soldiers, how they try to get rid of them, how they fish them out of the trenches, how they take off their clothes, and then put those clothes back onto the front lines, and they end up in the hands of people like Paul and Kat. And you're like, oh god. You see like the first 3 minutes of this film, which just focuses on the ugly nature of disposing of dead bodies in war. And then you get to like these scenes of like these chipper kids who want to serve in the war. And it's one of those things where it's just like, you can see the killer behind the hall, and you're just watching the victims just go straight for it. So you're watching these characters like, yeah, it'll be fun, go off to war, and then slowly as they get closer and closer into the trenches and then end up in the trenches, it's not fun at all. It's a horrible experience. It's muddy. It's gruesome. It's sickening. It's starving. It's dirty. It's chaotic, and just you watch so many of these soldiers die in the worst ways. And the thing is, I like the way that they set up how this war is framed, because it'd be so easy to just make it, here's, like these people are the enemy and this is why we're fighting. That's not the key thing to have an anti-war film. I feel like a lot of anti-war films that center just on the war itself try to make the enemy kind of more of like an other. Like, we don't get to see most of the opposing forces beyond just like shreds of humanity in there. We don't see much of like the politics that go on here, because that's not the point. That's not like, if you want to know the politics of World War One, you can read it up. This is all about the soldiers who serve in the trenches who don't realize much of what's going on here, that they're just kind of like forced into the scenario and, experience the terror head on. So you get to see people die in the worst ways possible. They get shot at, they get gutted, they get blown up by explosives, by grenades, tanks run over them, flamethrowers set them on fire, and some die immediately and some die slowly from wounds that don't get treated, while they try to navigate the countryside, and just it does not work out. Like, barely anyone survives by the end of this picture. In fact, even when you get to the end of the film, which highlights the key moment where, they realize that the war will end at this specific time. And you would think like, okay, by that point, the war should be over, right? There's no reason to fight. But the fighting still continued up to that point. It continued, it got worse, more people died, and we focus on these characters just as the clock strikes 12. And it wasn't 12, was it? It was like on the at 11 o'clock. That's right. At the 11th hour, the war stops. But at that moment, so much damage has been done, and one person has just died at that point. Where if they had just held back a few more minutes or hadn't got involved in this fight at all, they'd still be alive. But no, they get to die just as the war ends, and it's ultimately, that last bit of fighting was for nothing. It was absolutely worthless. War does nothing but dehumanize people and take away their lives in that moment. And just like it feels like, if you're familiar with like the original film, it's like, okay, yes, this is how you go about doing it, but it's also intense. The direction by Edward Berger is perfect here, by always focusing on the most violent and hideous moments. Like when tanks run over into trenches, you get to see bodies crushed and mutilated. You don't shy away from any of the violence here, if that's the point you're trying to make about how, you shouldn't have these types of wars. They shouldn't be celebrated. They should be recognized for the inhumanity that comes about with them. Like you can argue like the politics and like how they come about, but ultimately, yeah, it's dehumanizing. Especially, that being said, like the intensity is ramped up, and you can feel it. You can feel just like the fear coursing through everyone, all the soldiers' eyes, and even through like your own veins, thanks to like the music here by Volker. I'm gonna mispronounce his name. Volker Balterman does an amazing job with the score. If you can't tell already, this is a German film. So, yeah, I really do appreciate the direction here. I feel like for trying to stress, you know, how much of like a grotesque experience World War One was, this film does a great job. So as far as like a technical upgrade for this type of story, it's surprisingly effective and absolutely gut-wrenching to watch what goes down on screen, which is something you really want out of an anti-war film like this. So, to director Edward Berger, you did not miss with this film. You were right on target. So yeah, All Quiet on the Western Front, currently playing on Netflix. So there we go. We got through all these movies. So yeah, there you go. Not really any big Christmas films. Although if you really are in the mood for a Christmas movie this weekend, go see Violent Night. Violent Night's a fun Santa Claus subversion film. I found out it's actually doing fairly well at the box office. And why wouldn't? It's perfectly timed for the season. So, if you haven't seen it already, go see Violent Night. It's a lot of fun. So yeah, what a year it's been, and it's not even over yet. We still got more films to cover, and I still got like a best of the year to go over, and we'll go over all that because, man, my list is still it's still tough to like just pick out like 10 films from this year that I think are the best, because there's been so many good ones, and it's getting a little bit tricky to decide. And I'm also trying to like catch up on a few that I missed as well from the festival circuits. So we will get to that as well. And there's also a few more for your consideration films I'm still working on. So there's more to cover. So expect another stream next week. So, whoa, did not expect the music to be that loud. Okay, so let's do a quick recap before we sign off here. Babylon is definitely one of my favorite films of the year. Damien Chazelle's masterpiece about Hollywood's amazing nature of making movies, and also its hideousness and grotesqueness, and just it's a surreal, bizarre trip. Very polarizing. Not going to be everyone's jam, but it is my jam, and I love it. Oh, and also expect to see. I'm hoping my review will like tip that Rotten Tomatoes score, because I have one coming out, and it's overwhelmingly positive. So keep an eye out for that. Reviewed Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, a surprisingly fun and meaningful adventure for Puss in Boots, focusing on his own mortality. Amazing visuals, great characters, pretty fun film. We reviewed Living, the British remake of Ikaru. Fairly standard and faithful adaptation, and Bill Nighy's performance really makes this film work. If you haven't seen Ikaru, I dare say you might actually love this film, but if you have seen the film, you just be like, alright, that's a good adaptation. Could have been worse. Reviewed Guillermo del Toro's Pinnochio, a stop-motion animated musical, which he's been pushing for years. Great messaging, great animation, decent music, but a little scattershot here and there. So, still a good film. And then we reviewed All Quiet on the Western Front, a brilliantly savage and hard-to-watch anti-war film, but nonetheless necessary for depicting the horrors of World War I once again, but this time with a more beefed-up appearance to look even more real and relatable. So there you go. those are our reviews. You could check. Let me engage the credits here. If you want to read more reviews, you can check out movieswithmark.com, filminquiry.com, and twincitiesgeek.com. I will be back next week with even more reviews. We'll be reviewing a lot of stuff. We'll be reviewing Women Talking. We'll be reviewing Glass Onion, the latest mystery from Rian Johnson, and a few more. A few other surprises. There's a huge stack of films. Those are like the ones I know for sure I will be covering next week. So tune in next time. And hey, if you'd like to support the stream, if you like what you've seen, if you like the movie reviews, if you want to see more video essays, which I'm kind of working on, like I'm kind of like a little bit of a lack of inspiration for some of them, especially since I was gonna do one on the Snyderverse, which I had the audio recorded, but I might have to re-record it just because I'll be honest, the Snyderverse video essay has gotten away from me because so much has happened within the past year. Like, I would start writing it and something new would come out, and then I'd record it and something new would come out, and then I'd start editing the video and something new would come out. So it keeps changing that I might have to focus on other video essays. Because I do have other scripts ready, I'll work on that. But yeah, if you'd like to support all that and see some of the video essays that I didn't make, like I've recorded audio for but never made them, you can check them out on my Patreon. It's should be linked on the YouTube page. Feel free to subscribe, like, and the reviews that we covered on the stream should be available in singular videos starting next week, depending on how I get to them. And yeah, be sure to check out like all the other social stuff. I gotta post new social links because like I'm still on Twitter, but of course, you know, like Twitter's days are kind of numbered. So I'm also additionally on Mastodon and Hive. So if you want to check those out, like my username is Movies with Mark. So you could probably find me on Mastodon or Hive. If Hive, I think Hive is still working. Like it's all over the place. And the other thing I forgot to mention, I just got the confirmation I'm signed up for it now, is Post. I am on Post now. So if you look for Mark McPherson on Post.com, I should be there as well. So yeah, read all the stuff there, check out all the videos, and yeah, happy holidays to you all. Go watch some great movies, recommended a bunch. Go watch Violent Night in Babylon. If you're dead set on going to the theater, go watch Babylon or Violent Night. Or if you got the kids, go see like Puss in Boots, the last wish. So great films all around. So I will check back next week. So until then, have a good one, everybody.